Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weep Union, and in this one, the Russians managed to advance in the Kharkiv section of the front line across the Oskil River line and near the Dachne and near the border area between Russia and Ukraine. The Russians also advanced within Dachne and Andriyivka to the west of Kova. Starting out in Kova direction, the Russians managed to gain control over the southwestern outskirts of Dachne and some of the fortified positions in the area. This is an update from yesterday, and this advance allowed the Russians to gain control over the southern outskirts of the town and forcing the Ukrainians out to the outskirts of it. This means that the Russians will likely gain control over Dachne over the next couple of days, as the Russians will push the Ukrainians out of the town and into the open fields where there will be no escape for them unless they are completely exposed. The Russians continued their encirclement of the Ukrainian forces within the eastern parts of Andriyivka and have pushed further along the western section of the front line, pushing towards the center of Andriyivka and getting close to the highway from Andriyivka towards the north of Konstantinopel. The Russians have managed to encircle Ukrainian forces in the eastern part of the town, and this encirclement has been further secured with this new advance. At the same time, the Russians are now reaching closer to the intersection, which will allow the Russians to start operations towards Konstantinopel itself in the south. At the same time, the Russians, with their control over fortified positions in the northern parts of the town, will now be able to push alongside the fortified positions further north to cut off the Ukrainian forces in the northern parts of Andriyivka and advance further along the highway itself, which will be their main axis of attack through the town, as they are looking to cut off Ukrainian forces in different sections of it and reach the supply lines and the choke points within the town. This will allow them to encircle more and more forces as they advance towards the western outskirts. And again, similar to Dachne and Ulakli, generally the towns in the area are so far isolated from the remaining parts that whenever the Russians push the Ukrainians out to the outskirts, they'll have to cross open fields where they're completely exposed. And this allows the Russians to cut off more forces than usual, as the Ukrainians will have a very difficult time withdrawing from these towns, and this leaves them exposed if they do not withdraw early on. And now that there are significant forces within Andriyivka present fighting against the Russian forces, we can see that the Ukrainians will likely take a lot of losses during the battles of these frontline towns like Dachne, Ulakli, Konstantinopel, Oskil and Andriyivka, as they are unable to safely withdraw to the next town. The fighting is currently centered around Dachne in the east and Andriyivka in the north, but will soon expand to the fortified position in between Dachne and Ulakli itself and Konstantinopel, where a combined assault from the northern and southern directions will take place to push the Ukrainian forces out of the town. This will encircle the Ukrainian forces within Ulakli and the fortified positions west of Dachne, and the Russians in the north near Andriyivka would be able to connect their forces between the north and the south for operations further westwards in the direction of Bahadir, Oleksiivka and Roslev. In the Kharkiv section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance to the north of the Dachne, gain control over some forest lines southwest of Novomlinsk, further connecting the towns of the Dachne with the village of Novomlinsk, as the Russians slowly expand their zone of control on the western bank of the Oskil River line and their bridgehead across. The Russians also managed to advance to the rear of Topoli, where they managed to cross over the river line, gain a foothold, and start a battle over the western outskirts of Topoli. At the same time, the Russians crossed over the border area along the first patches. Here, they are probing the Ukrainian defenses along the border area, seeing if they can clear some of the minefields and fortifications in the area before crossing into the country itself to battle over Topoli. Getting control over Topoli will allow the Russians to have a road connection that will allow them to cross into the Ukrainian border area and move into the western bank of the Oskil River line through Russian territory. And this will allow the Russians to significantly expand their presence here across the Oskil River line. This will allow the Russians to connect their forces all the way down south near Kupiansk to the border area, and from there, further offensive operations can take place. This brings us to the continuation of my frontline analysis in terms of further offensive operations. We've covered the eastern section of the front line all the way down south to the southern section of the front line, and we now cover the area from the Kharkiv region and all the way to the Chernihiv region. We will cover the Kharkiv region itself, the Sumy and Kursk regions, as well as the Chernihiv and Bryansk regions. Taking a look at the current situation in the Kharkiv region, we see that there is a presence of Russian forces in the eastern parts of it. This is both on the eastern and western bank of the Oskil River line. And the main presence of the Ukrainian forces in the eastern parts of the Oskil River line is fairly limited, as the Russians are launching operations alongside it to gain full control of it, and the Ukrainians are slowly being pushed away. The Russians have significantly expanded and doubled their presence on the eastern bank of the Oskil River line over the past year. However, this is not enough to push the Ukrainians back out. Instead, the Russians are currently focusing on the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces east of Kupiansk, where their objective is to gain control over Kupiansk itself, which will finish the encirclement and completely cut off the Ukrainian forces, while the Ukrainians are attempting to free up their forces by cancelling this encirclement before it even begins. And then the fighting will reach the remaining parts of the eastern bank of the Oskil River line to the southern bank of the Severodonetsk River line, moving through the south of Liman. And the objective of the Russians here is to significantly improve their positions in the northern flank of the Donetsk region. Now, if we take a look at the Kharkiv region itself, the Russians also have a presence in the northern outskirts of it, north of the city of Kharkiv. The Russians here have a presence in the Ukrainian side of the border area, where they are fighting within Vovchansk for control over the town, and they have a foothold across near Lipsy, where they are simply moving on to the defensive and attempting to hold on to their position as long as possible. The Russian positions here, objective is to force the Ukrainians to redirect their forces here, spreading out their forces and launching counterattacks. However, this is not necessarily all that there is to it, because taking a look at the Vovchansk direction, there is limited direct connection to Kharkiv itself. Instead, the main highway goes towards the east. This is to connect to the highways that connects the entire region east of the city itself. It connects the Vorishne with Vovchansk, and it connects through Veliki Burluk to Kharkiv itself. At the same time, this highway also connects to Kupiansk and again towards the west near Kharkiv, and then also down south along the Oskil River line towards Izium itself, and again connecting with the western side. So we see these highways are well connected, and it all starts with Vovchansk from Belgorod to Izium. That is the most direct highway that is located between the city and the town. And this explains exactly why it was so important for the Ukrainians to limit the Russian offensive here and to prevent them from crossing across the river line. However, as the situation stands right now, the Ukrainian forces are low on manpower, and they are mainly focusing on the Kursk incursion in terms of their reinforcements, and secondary to that is the Oskil River line and the Donetsk region. Now, if the Russians increase their presence in the northern parts near Kharkiv, and at the same time if they launch new operations along the border area, this could put extremely heavy pressure on the Ukrainian forces. If the Russians launch an operation from the eastern parts of the Kharkiv region and launch the operation to connect with Vovchansk in the west, they'll be able to gain control over the northern parts of the Kharkiv region and start operations to connect with the Oskil River line as well, and this will allow the Russians to launch operations to regain control over the parts of the Kharkiv region all the way down south to Izium, as they had control of at the start of the war. Now, if we take a look at the recap of the start of the war, we can see that this is the Oskil River line here in the center, and this is the Vovchansk direction. We see that the main push actually came from the Vovchansk direction to reach the Oskil River line, encircling the Ukrainian forces near the border area, and then moving down south alongside the river line. And in a matter of a month, the Russians reached Izium to gain control over the town, and within 2 to 3 months, the Russians gained control over the northern bank of the Severodonetsk River from the Luhansk region and all the way towards the city of Kharkiv. So we see that the offensive operations of the Russians was focused around the eastern bank of the river line and the northern bank of the river line, and the objective here is to completely match the front line with the river line. Now, if we draw that out on the map itself, we can see it goes through the areas here to the northwest of Izium, alongside the area, and all the way down south to the town itself, and then down to the south of Liman towards Sloviansk. Now, if we take a look at the front line as it is, we will see that the Russians would be looking to advance from both flanks down towards the Oskil River line, connecting to Dachne, and then alongside the western bank, where they look to align the front line with the river line itself in the western parts, then connect with the towns in the area, gain control over Shevchenkova, Kupiansk, and all the way down to Balaklia, then down south towards Izium. And the objective of the Russians here would be to take advantage of the lack of manpower of the Ukrainian armed forces, where it will not have several layers of forces defending the areas here in the Kharkiv region. Therefore, a new offensive operations might be able to break through the Ukrainian lines, and this will allow them to go beyond the Ukrainian lines and establish further control over significant advances here to the east of Kharkiv, and this will allow them to regain control over the entire Kharkiv offensive that the Ukrainians meant to regain control of at the end of 2022. However, it is also likely that the Ukrainians will be able to stabilize the front line and prevent a breakthrough, because they simply do have that many forces. Despite the lack of manpower, it is the lack to both launch offensive and defensive operations at a proper scale, while in reality they do have enough forces to purely defend. However, this will require for the Ukrainian forces to make some sacrifices in other sections of the front line to stabilize the front line here. But again, a complete breakthrough of Ukrainian forces east of the Kharkiv region would make it worth to sacrifice some other sections of the front line, especially areas such as the Kursk region, which are theoretically insignificant, and the Ukrainians have held on to it for a long time, so they've proven that they're able to hold on to it. The issue is that they are losing a lot of forces for practically nothing but PR. Therefore, stabilizing the front line east of Kharkiv would be much more important, and it will also be good for their PR, so they really have no excuse to not realize and focus on that instead. Therefore, I believe that there is a large likelihood for a Russian offensive that will take place in the eastern section of the front line to gain control over Izium and Liman, the Oskil River line, and the Severodonetsk River line in its entirety here to the east of Kharkiv, and the objective would be to further strengthen their offensive operations in the Donetsk region itself by flanking their supply lines and completely cutting off all railways and highways going in and out of the Donetsk region, both from the western direction through Pokrovsk and the northern direction through Kova and Izium. And this may even allow the Russians to physically encircle the Ukrainian forces. The timeline for such an operation would likely span a couple of months, as Russians would need to break through the initial lines of Ukrainian defenses, and following that they would have to constantly readapt to the situation, as the Ukrainians would send reinforcements to the area, and they would not be willing to withdraw from significant fortified positions such as near Vovchansk and the first line of defense, as well as Shevchenko in the second line of defense, and along the Oskil River line in general. A withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from that area would significantly slow down Russian offensive operations. However, if they fail to withdraw their forces from the eastern bank of the Oskil River line, the Russians may even significantly speed up their offensive operations and cause a local collapse of Ukrainian forces. And for that, we'll end this video here to not go too deep and too long with this video. Instead, we'll take a look at the Sumy, Kursk, and Chernihiv regions, as well as the Bryansk region in future video. And that'll be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.